Okay. So welcome. I see a bunch more folks are coming in from the waiting room. I'm so glad to welcome all of you here this afternoon. We will get started at exactly 1:33, which is Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association for on time, 3 minutes after the hour, as more and more folks filter in. So glad that you are all here this afternoon. Many participants, I see many participants from lots of different places, lots of different aspects, connection to the work that we're doing here today. It's lovely to see so many folks. Welcome. If you like to say hello in the chat, feel free to. We're going to ask people to stay muted for most of for all of this this webinar, and when we do get to questions, we'll take them through the chat. So I appreciate you staying muted, and welcome in this afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Okay, it's 1:33. Welcome, folks. Eric.
All right. Yes. So as you see from my name in the bottom here, my name is Eric Kaplan, and I have the pleasure of being a vice president at the Mordecai Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood, which is one of the co-sponsors of today's event. This webinar on democracy and Judaism, does one need the other to thrive? We created the Kaplan Center about 14 years ago because we felt that there was a lot of richness in Kaplan's thought, and that it wasn't being as discussed as much as it could be, not only within Reconstructionism, but elsewhere. And one of the areas where there's clearly a lot of richness in Kaplan's thought is in the area of democracy, especially if you take a look at The Future of the American Jew from 1948, which is written during World War II. It's very clearly a response to the rise of fascism. Kaplan is very concerned about what he sees as potential defeat of democracy, not only in Europe, but ultimately in the United States. And I just wanted to really take 2 minutes. When we talk about Kaplan's belief in democracy as religion, you kind of have to go one step, earlier than that to think about what Kaplan means by religion. So as he writes in The Greater Judaism in the Making, the essence of a religion is the effort to discover what makes life worthwhile and to bring life into conformity with those laws on which the achievement of a worthwhile life depends. I'll repeat that because Kaplan is not always easily accessible on first read. The essence of a religion is the effort to discover what makes life worthwhile and to bring life into conformity with those laws on which the achievement of a worthwhile life depends. So when he says democracy is a religion, he says that it is a belief that this particular method of organizing public life is inherently worthwhile, and following its path leads to the enrichment of our lives. But as he says in The Future of the American Jew, democracy is a faith. Why? Because its validity is not scientifically demonstrable. It demands a priori acceptance of ideals which can be proved valid only by our committing ourselves to their realization. It's really up to us to prove that this is true. And finally, to also quote from the Future of the American Jew, we know that the unalienable rights on which democracy is based cannot be validated by the actual way in which human beings behave towards one another. But we assume that, quote, men are endowed by their creator, forgive the language, with these rights. This is a decidedly religious assumption, right? Because it's unproven assumption. It's coming from a certain view of what makes life worthwhile. What is a pathway to making life worthwhile? And to continue with Kaplan, on such an assumption, the American people builds its nationhood. So I think it's a pretty interesting and compelling view of what religion is, and one of those ways that Kaplan, I think, can contribute to our contemporary thinking about issues that are of great, of significance to us as much as they were when he wrote them. So I turn things over to the real presenters today.
Thank you so much, Eric. And we're delighted to have you here and delighted to have the Kaplan Center as one of several co-sponsors of this program, although one of the initiating co-sponsors. And I did just put a link to the Kaplan Center into the chat for those of you who'd like to learn more about the work that they do there. So to begin our conversation today, so as we've heard, over 50 years ago, Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, posited that democracy was essential for a vibrant and thriving Jewish people or Jewish community. Kaplan also posited that democracy, as Eric told us, is the religion of America, and he intimated inevitable here and across the globe. Many of us, especially those of us of a certain age who grew up assuming democracy, or at least in the United States, assuming democracy was firmly rooted and immovable, have become shocked to see that indeed democracy is in fact flimsier and more at risk than we ever might have thought it could be. Whether you date the beginning of that unraveling and that lack of stability to the January 6th insurrection, or to Trump's initial 2016 election, or even further back to 9/11, the 9/11 attacks and the ensuing degradation of civil liberties that this country experienced, many of us are shocked at what we see before us. In Israel, a year of pro-democracy protests, the largest the country had ever seen, against the winnowing away of the rule of law and democratic principles there, more or less evaporated with the Hamas attacks on April 7th and the ensuing war. With the rise of autocratic rulers across the globe and the very real threat of rising anti-Semitism in the places that we Jews call home, can we dare to say that democracy is ever or ever was inevitable? Can we count on it in America, in Israel, or as a Jewish commitment and value? And what, if anything, does democracy, its existence and stability, mean for Jews and Judaism? So these are just some of the light questions that I hope that our panelists will help us answer today. So I will introduce each of our speakers as they give some opening remarks from their perspective and experience, and then we hope for a lively conversation amongst our panelists. If we have time toward the end, we will be happy to take some questions through the chat. Our first panelist is Rabbi Dr. William Plevan, Visiting Assistant Professor of Contemporary Thought at RRC, and currently serves as its inaugural Democracy Fellow for this current year. His essays on contemporary Jewish theology, ethics, and political thought have been published in several books for scholars and general readers. He currently serves as the co-chair of the board of Tru'ah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, and which is an absolutely essential organization in the fight for democracy and human rights in this country. So Bill, as our resident historian, please provide some additional context and nuance on Kaplan's thoughts about democracy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Elyse, and thank you to everyone. It's really an honor to be with such a esteemed panel of folks who do really so much of the hard work of building democracy in this country and in Israel And it's wonderful to be with all of you. And thank you to Eric and the Kaplan Center for making this possible. I'll sort of the few remarks that I'll make kind of build on some of the things that Eric was mentioning before. I really want to make three observations about Mordecai Kaplan's thought around the theme of democracy. And I'll say three things. The first is something about how Kaplan understands democracy. The second is how Kaplan understood the challenge of being Jewish or building Jewish life and Jewish community in the context of American democracy. And the third is about what I'll call religious freedom, though I'll sort of, I think that's a provisional title for what I'm going to say, talk about. The first is that for Kaplan, when he talks about democracy, he doesn't just mean a system of government. He's also talking about an ethos or spirit that characterizes an entire society. So when he talks about the significance of democracy or the importance of democracy for modern Judaism, he's not just talking about having a certain kind of system of government defined by elections and rule of law and individual liberty. He does care about those things, but he means something much, much broader and deeper. And I would say that I think it's possible to define what he means by democracy, and this is not him alone, but to see what he means by democracy in terms of two characteristics. One is a democratic society is one that is characterized by its commitment to promote well-being and flourishing of all of its members equally. And the second is to empower all of its members, and certainly to allow, but I think also to empower all of its members to have a say in the norms and values by which that society lives. Now, for the first characteristic, you'll notice I use this word well-being and human flourishing. For those of you who are familiar with Kaplan's work, that I'm using those terms to be equivalent to roughly what he means by salvation, right? So when he uses that term in his theology, right? For purposes of this conversation, I think well-being and human flourishing will suffice, right? So that's one thing, is that Kaplan means that a society is characterized by empowering people to speak and have a say in how the society is governed and the norms and values that it lives by, and also that it's committed to the well-being of all the people in that society equally. So the second thing is, how did Kaplan view the emergence of democracy, particularly in America, in relationship to Jewish community and Jewish life? Well, one thing that Kaplan writes about, particularly in his earlier writings in around 1915 and 1916, is he writes about a concern that the emerging democratic society that he sees in America would actually be a really significant challenge to the continuity of Jewish communal and organizational life. But the reason that he thinks that is that he sees within democracy a tremendous capacity to integrate different groups and to bring sort of different groups into harmony with one another. Now, you have to see that Kaplan is looking at things very much like many other white ethnic immigrant groups. Kaplan himself is an immigrant. He's looking at things very much from the standpoint of many white immigrant groups, like Jews who come from Europe, white Jews who come from Europe, Italians, Poles, Irish, right, who in many respects face a lot of discrimination and racism in American society, but also are sort of integrating into American society. And it's really important to note here that while Kaplan is very aware of what we would call anti-Black racism, I don't think that either in his earlier period or his later period that he fully appreciates the depth of anti-Black racism as a kind of distinct form of systematic racism in American society. He's very aware of it, and he opposes it vociferously. He's very supportive of civil rights in his time. But I don't think he really appreciated the depth of anti-Black racism. And this is an important point in understanding the way he thinks about democracy, that he sees democracy as having this tremendous potential for integration, and therefore that Jews who are living in American society are going to be very attracted to the democratic ethos that I named at first, right? And because they're going to be attracted to it, if they see that Judaism is at odds with that democratic ethos, they're going to be drawn away from Judaism in the spirit of that democratic ethos. And so he thinks it's absolutely essential for Judaism to internalize that democratic ethos, because without that, he thinks Jews won't stay within Judaism. They won't see Judaism as a source of their human flourishing and well-being. So now when Kaplan says things like this, he sounds very strategic, right? It's as if like, well, we have to make do, we have to kind of fit into democracy, right? That sounds like a very strategic kind of anti-assimilationist approach. And it's true, but it's important to appreciate that Kaplan also wants us to embrace a democratic ethos in Judaism, because he thinks it's the right thing, because he thinks that the democratic spirit is genuinely the best way of understanding how a society promotes human flourishing. The third thing is that Kaplan really does appreciate the extent to which in his time, and he articulates, and Eric is kind of mentioning some of this in the context of World War II, you see it also in his writings in the 1930s, is that Kaplan does see the American democratic system as pitched in a struggle between more chauvinistic nationalist forces and more what we'll call multicultural. Kaplan didn't quite have that term, but I think he's naming something quite similar, a kind of multicultural conception of democracy. Now, again, Kaplan may not have been as attentive to the significance of anti-Black racism as posing a challenge, but I think that we could sort of update Kaplan's vision in a way that recognizes the depths of anti-Black racism in American society. But Kaplan already understands that democracy has to be fought for and struggled with against forces of chauvinism. So what he's seeing in the American context, say in the 1930s, is a way of thinking about democracy where democracy is really just for a certain elite, say white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, so that it's the elite group or the privileged group that gets to have a say, or that it's the elite or privileged group that the government serves for their well-being and flourishing, but not for everybody, right? So it's really hierarchical and stratified. And Kaplan says, Kaplan sees that Jews should be participating in an active effort to fight on behalf of a conception of democracy that includes different groups. And part of what that means is not only different people as individuals, right? And there's not just protecting the rights of Jews as individuals, but also the rights of groups, religious or ethnic groups of different kinds, to maintain their group identity. That's why I said religious freedom was kind of a provisional title. That part of what he wants to see in democracy is the ability for a society to allow for different groups to articulate a different ethical, religious, and spiritual way of life, and to live by that way of life within a broader society. So that for Kaplan, real democracy isn't achieved unless you can have different kinds of groups living according to their own spiritual ideals, not necessarily in separation from each other, but actually in a way that kind of contributes to the society, so that Jews will kind of live according to Jewish values and Jewish ideals in a way that both serves the Jewish community, but also serves American society more broadly. And that's how he views religious freedom. It's not just my individual choice to choose a religious way of life. It's about the rights of different groups to be able to articulate and live by different visions of the good life, different visions of human flourishing and salvation. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. There's so much more that I want to ask about just in your comments alone, but we're going to move on. And thank you for setting that groundwork for us in Kaplan's thought. So we're going to turn now to the people who are working in the field today against many of the similar, I think, forces that Kaplan was seeing in the 1930s, which is somewhat scary to say, but absolutely true. So we turn now to we're turning now to Aaron Dorfman, who is the founder and executive director of A More Perfect Union, the Jewish Partnership for Democracy, which is an effort to mobilize the American Jewish community to protect and strengthen American democracy. Previously, Aaron served as president of the Lippman Confer Foundation for Living Torah. He previously was vice president for programs at the American Jewish World Service and also served as director of informal education at Temple Isaiah of Contra Costa County. Aaron, is democracy still essential for Jews today? And how do we take those messages from Kaplan in understanding our current situation?
Thanks, Elyse, and Bill. Thanks for teeing that up. The audacity of that vision is I'd say humbling and inspiring of Kaplan's thought. So just gratitude to Elyse and Eric for convening this panel and inviting me to speak. I'm thrilled to have this chance to learn with and from my incredible fellow panelists, and with all of you who've joined us for the afternoon, morning, evening, whatever time it is. So I lead this organization, A More Perfect Union, and we start at A More Perfect Union from the premise that Jews have it better in America than we've had it anywhere else in the diaspora in the last 2,000 years. This country represents the first time in history in which we as Jews are no more the interlopers than anyone else. Through most of Jewish history, we've arrived as guests at someone else's table, sometimes tolerated, sometimes invited, but always a bit provisionally. But when we arrived here, there was no kind of ancien regime to which we needed to appeal as supplicants or from which we needed to beg favor. At its best, though we've been struggling since the beginning to live up to that best, America elevates diversity and pluralism as intrinsic values. We are one people among many. And I think Kaplan's thought kind of concretizes that in a powerful way. So that system, we call that system a democracy for sure, but it's not a pure democracy. And that's a really important distinction. I think something that bears consideration. We're a liberal democracy, a constitutional democracy, one in which the government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, but whose powers are starkly limited in ways that very intentionally protect minorities like us from the tyranny of the majority. Our freedoms of speech and of the press, our freedom to assemble, our freedom to exercise our religion, all of these things are guaranteed in the Constitution, and even a government elected by a large majority can't abrogate them. We even have the miracle of Article 6 baked into that Constitution before the Bill of Rights that declares, quote, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States." When that was adopted, it was absolutely radical, right? No nation state in history had ever made such an explicit commitment to religious neutrality. As with so many of our other founding aspirations, living into that commitment has been a work in progress. It wasn't until 1826 that the Maryland General Assembly passed an act to extend, I love the title of this act, the act to extend to the sect of people professing the Jewish religion the same rights and privileges enjoyed by Christians. The fight for that legislation was led by Jacob Cohen Jr. and Solomon Edding, who later ran for Baltimore City Council, served on Baltimore City Council, and became the first Jews to hold elected office in Maryland. It wasn't until 1862 that Jewish advocacy led the United States government to appoint the first Jewish chaplains to serve Jewish soldiers fighting in the Union Army. And despite successes like that, we've of course faced like real challenges in this country. It's American democracy and its commitment to religious freedom is a work in progress, like the rest of America, like Judaism, I would argue. During the Civil War, Ulysses Grant expelled Jews from the Department of the Tennessee until his order was revoked by President Lincoln. There was a U.S. Army manual published during World War I for recruits to serve in the Army that said the foreign-born and especially Jews are more apt to malinger than the native-born. Right, so like we've been working our way into this religious freedom that's so essential to our identity and our community in this country for a long time. But the norms and institutions that form the bedrock of liberal democracy in this country have consistently triumphed over those challenges. And I would argue that it is those democratic norms and institutions that make us as a Jewish community in America possible. Synagogues, community centers, social service agencies, day schools, summer camps, Jewish film festivals, vegan advocacy groups, arts collectives, Jewish farming communities, radio stations, 12-step groups, publishing companies, the Jewish Braille Institute, We have created in this country a vibrant civil society comprising something like 7,500 Jewish institutions that form the kind of bedrock of rich, vibrant, and diverse Jewish life. Not, I imagine, what Alexis de Tocqueville imagined when he thought about, the civil society that's American democracy's superpower, but like we've taken that baton and run with it. And I think it's important to name that the democratic norms and institutions that make us possible are just as important for the ultra-Orthodox community as they are for secular Jews, just as important for the Jewish left as they are for the Jewish right. Even with all the things that we fight about, LGBTQ rights, egalitarianism, religious freedom, Israel, religious schools, public schools, all of those things, American liberal democracy provides a container in which we can have those fights publicly, in relative safety and security, and without fear of existential consequences. And our success hasn't only been insular to our community. We've also engaged the levers of democracy to play meaningful roles in shaping the direction of this country for all of its citizens. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Jewish labor movement took part in strikes and demonstrations that achieved the 8-hour workday, fought back against sweatshop conditions. In 1964, Jews made up half of all of the young people who participated in Mississippi Freedom Summer that helped advance the civil rights movement. Jews fought for like legislation related to the Soviet Jewish community, and I'd say, like, even in the last few months, a period of extreme turmoil in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks in Israel, Jews in the United States have exercised our rights to advocate for our interests. We assembled hundreds of thousands of us on the National Mall to advocate for U.S. support for Israel. And just last week, Senator Chuck Schumer, the most senior Jewish elected official to ever serve in the US government, used his platform to offer a critique of Israel's war in Gaza. Our ability as a community to exercise our voices in this way is sui generis in Jewish history, and that's something that we really need to remember. I'll close by invoking a joke made famous by the late David Foster Wallace. In a commencement address at Kenyon College in 2005, he said, 2 fish are swimming along, and they pass by like an older fish. They're young fish. And the older fish says, "Hey, boys, how's the water?" And they keep swimming along. And after a few minutes, one of them says to the other one, "What the hell is water?" I think liberal democracy is the water in which we in the American Jewish community swim, and we're making a serious mistake if we ignore it or take it for granted.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you. I am moved and compelled by that comment, and your notion that it's not just democracy, but it's liberal constitutional democracy that enables Jews to the Jewish community in America to thrive as a protected minority, a minority protected from the tyranny of the majority, feels especially cogent and important as we turn to our attention across the world to my dear friend, Rabbi Amy Klein. Amy is a pastoral counselor serving at-risk youth, elders, and individuals and families coping with serious illness. She also works with families in Israel's northern periphery to create meaningful life cycle ceremonies. And since 2020, she has been active in the protest movement to save Israel's democracy and currently serves on the National Council of the Grassroots Movement Standing Together, which I want to give a shout out to. Amy has lived in Israel since 1997 and resides with her family in Kibbutz Lahavot HaBashan in the Hula Valley. So first and foremost, Amy, we're so glad that you're here with us this evening for you. Thank you for staying up late and joining us. And we also send blessings and love to you and your family. You are way up in the north under threat of Hezbollah rockets. We were on the phone one day when something came flying over, and I saw that moment with you. Just know that we are here and we love you, and we're grateful that you're able to spend a little time in reflective thought with us that is hopefully somewhat of a balm, A-B-A-L-M, to your current existence. Amy.
Thank you so much. And really thank you to everybody, all the sponsoring organizations and to my fellow panel members. It's really an honor to be with all of you. And I am just sort of resonating with a couple of sentences that were said before me. So, if Professor Bill talked about, Kaplan's vision, and Aaron, you picked up and said it was very, very inspiring. And I'll say that it's very inspiring. And then, sort of with just to let you in on the vibe that's here in Israel, there's also something about inspiring visions that unfortunately right now is getting most of us depressed and needing to sort of fight that off. And so it's helpful to have these things named as inspirations. And I also think that perhaps much of what I'm going to say is going to maybe be a mirror image of what Aaron just spoke about so eloquently, and putting it in the context of what's happening right now in Israel. So Kaplan's teaching that there's a difference between viewing democracy as a system and democracy as an ethos or moral ideal, I think is really key to understanding the protest in Israel against the judicial takeover of 2023 and our continued struggle to prevent Israel from becoming, and unfortunately this is not an exaggeration, from becoming a modern dictatorship and even a messianic religious one. There's been a misuse and abuse of the term democracy as meaning participatory democracy. Aaron really spoke to this, a mere system. Basically, we've been told you lost the vote, shut up and behave until you win the next election. And this idea that democracy stops at the ballot box essentially means, the way that I see it, that individuals can willfully choose to surrender their civil rights, rights of the individual, freedom of expression, of religion, to assemble, as well as the right to live in dignity, including the ability to earn a living wage, the right to health, education, welfare, to age in dignity, to raise a family, and the possibility to fulfill oneself, to use our Kaplanian terms. And of course, these rights are all to be safeguarded in the absence of physical and verbal violence and in accepting the other. And I have to say, I firmly believe that people cannot willfully surrender those rights. But that is, in essence, what is said when it is said that participatory democracy is sufficient. In Israel, I will say that those of us in favor of a liberal democratic ethos and not merely a system, and it's really important to put out here that one can be on the right and be very much in favor of this ethos, and we partner with people of different political views in our protest work. We've taken that ethos for granted for decades. And it's really easy to do when your life is okay. You have a nice home, you have food on the table, a decent job, and we haven't paid attention to infiltration and takeover of key institutions by those who are against liberal democracy, by those in favor of rule, by traditional Jewish law, continued occupation of Palestine, subjugation of non-Jewish citizens, racism, oppression of women, oppression of the poor through libertarian economics. We can go on, and this has been done with the help of Forum Kohelet. They've infiltrated the Ministry of Education, the media, the army, and more. And the ease at which it's possible to appoint political cronies to key positions, to funnel public funds inequitably, for example, to building in the occupied territories, and to ultra-Orthodox educational institutions without any oversight, and to avoid appointment of judges necessary for the carrying out of justice is astounding. In a democratic system, it is also possible to hand out machine guns to your supporters, to trample the rights of Palestinians, and depress law-abiding citizens under the cover of war. Because of the threat to our security, many of Israel's population do not value democracy sufficiently. Kaplan's ideology does not speak to them, and perhaps here he couldn't foresee or comprehend the minds of many, and I think that Bill really spoke to this in his opening comments. And here I'll say just really bluntly, there are people who want a leader who lies and cheats, because that is the kind of leader who will know how to protect them, particularly in Israel, where enemy threats are real, as is anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, people are blind to how this behavior has been and is currently damaging, from the dismantling of the Iran nuclear agreement, to the building up of Yahya Sinwar, to sabotaging hostage deals, currently continuing the occupation and their refusal to establish a Palestinian state. And I think we've seen just this week world leaders who've been stepping up, American leaders and European leaders, and to say how the current government has been damaging. In Israel, I'll add that democracy is an ethos, as the ethical spirit of multiculturalism faces its own specific barrier. It's practically a different version of what we see in the US and other countries where the majority population is threatened by another culture. People are willing to grant individual civil rights and often will cite friendships with citizens who are Palestinian, but are unwilling to grant cultural group rights to the other culture. They're afraid of granting official status to the Arabic language, to give over local control over education, celebration of customs, and more. And this is something that Jews fought for in the US. You know, I remember my mom out there, you know, being a real fighter for rights, for our rights. And I believe that Jewish gains in the US helped pave the way for other groups in the United States. But we're very far from reaching that celebration of multiculturalism in Israel. And the October 7th massacre has now made it even more difficult for Israeli Jews to endorse liberal democracy, not only on a practical ground, but also on moral grounds. And another consequence is that it will make it more difficult for secular Israeli Jews to redeem their Judaism by understanding that it can necessarily include a liberal democratic ethos, given that the ultra-Orthodox and fascist leaders of the government are exploiting the tragedy of October 7 to dismantle the imperfect democracy that we have in Israel. So much of that, of the bad that happens in Israel taints Judaism. So Judaism as we love it does need democracy, I will say, unequivocally, in order to thrive in Israel. Shortly before the war, I had actually suggested to schedule some sessions for interested fellow demonstrators on the Reconstructionist approach to Judaism, to discuss the incorporation of the democratic ethos into Judaism, why we should reject the idea of the chosen people, and more. And people were really curious. And unfortunately, we didn't get to those sessions. That was another time that I'll say it now feels quite like child's play compared to what we're currently facing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy. And I don't know whether to see the story that you tell about what has happened to democracy in Israel as the warning of the worst or the warning of the future. Although we in America don't live with the same physical specific threats that people in Israel do, the fear-mongering that we're experiencing in the United States feels somewhat similar, and how that is playing out in terms of our ability to hold on to civil liberties actually feels really important, and feels like a really good opportunity to turn to our fourth and final panelist, Amy Spitalnick. Amy is the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, the national convener of the Jewish coalitions working across communities to build a just and inclusive American democracy. She previously served as executive director of Integrity First for America, which won its groundbreaking lawsuit against the neo-Nazis and white supremacists and hate groups responsible for the Charlottesville violence. Amy, I think this is a good time to turn to you and help us understand how resurgent anti-Semitism and the threats to democracy that it represents holds a piece of this conversation. Amy.
Thank you so much, Elyse, and really just honored to be here with my fellow panelists who really laid out very compellingly why Jews are safest and thrive in the inclusive liberal democracies that we're all here to fight for. And I want to talk about sort of the flip side of that coin, how democracy is inextricably linked with the fight against anti-Semitism, because it really works in two directions. Yes, Jews are safest in inclusive liberal democracies, but it's just as important to understand how anti-Semitism is so often used as a tool to undercut democracy, to sow distrust in our democracy. And so many of us know how anti-Semitism operates as a racial, religious, ethnic form of bigotry. And in that way, it is very similar to other forms of hate. People hate us because we're Jewish, because of how we look, because of how we pray, because of a variety of different factors. But anti-Semitism also uniquely operates as this pernicious, insidious conspiracy theory rooted in lies about Jewish control and power. And that is used specifically to sow distrust in our democracy, in our institutions, to tear communities apart, to drive wedges into our society. And so at a moment when we're seeing increasingly normalized, not just anti-Semitism, but broader interconnected forms of hate and threats to our democracy, we need to understand how anti-Semitism is really used as the tool to fuel this broader political violence, broader anti-democratic extremism. We are seeing this in a variety of ways, right? You mentioned, Elyse, that I previously worked on a lawsuit against the neo-Nazis responsible for the Charlottesville violence. And when we saw Nazis in Charlottesville 6.5 years ago chanting, "Jews will not replace us," many of us were probably a little baffled at first, but unfortunately, 6.5 years later, we know precisely what they mean in terms of this vile, violent Great Replacement theory that posits Jews are orchestrating the replacement of the white race by supporting immigrants, refugees, Black and brown people. And we know it, and we can call it out when it's Nazis with torches in Charlottesville, or the cycle of white supremacist anti-Semitic violence that's followed, motivated by that same hate. The Pittsburgh shooting, which was the deadliest attack on the Jewish community on U.S. soil, the Poway shooting at a Chabad in California, El Paso, Buffalo, Jacksonville. You can go on and on in terms of the cycle of extremist violence we've seen motivated by these anti-Semitic white supremacist conspiracies targeting not just Jews, but so many communities. But of course, we've also seen this become increasingly normalized in our politics and society. Just a couple of weeks ago, a Jewish cabinet secretary impeached using language related to invasion and replacement. We have, of course, the former president using language about poisoning the blood, stopping the steal. So much of this ties back to the same fundamental conspiracy theories about a cabal and effort to replace the electorate, replace the white population, and to otherwise not just, again, threaten Jews, but threaten all of us. QAnon, of course, is another perfect example of how these conspiracy theories rooted in ideas of global cabals so often fuel broader extremism. And now in this moment, certainly before October 7th, but in a sharp, painful way that has become clear in the last 5.5 months, we also see how conspiracy theories related to Jewish control and power can manifest on the political left, on the far left, related to, Zionist control and power of our institutions, Jewish money, supporting Israel in ways that specifically suggest we are seeking to undercut our institutions, or political figures, or our government. And too often, not just feeding into some of the very same types of conspiracy theories we're talking about here that have been fully normalized on the political right, but also really seeking to drive Jews out of the coalitions we need to be in to fight for the inclusive liberal democracy we need in this moment, making us feel unsafe in spaces that we need to be in because all of our futures depend on it. And so, again, it's not just about the threat that anti-Semitism poses to democracy in the ways that I just described, but also how failure to protect democracy and protect the sorts of inclusive societies we know we're safest in creates the fertile ground for this anti-Semitism to continue to thrive in a constant feedback loop. And it makes all of us unsafe, not just Jews, but each and every community that has been targeted by these violent, vile conspiracy theories and mass shootings. And again, everyone who needs an inclusive democracy in which their own communities can thrive, and that we are less able to successfully advocate for when our coalitions are fractured. I just want to spend one more minute on specifically how anti-Semitism, at a moment when it's so normalized, is directly connected to this rise in political violence. We're seeing in poll after poll how belief in conspiracy theories is among the biggest driving motivations for political violence and anti-democratic extremism. The University of Chicago, which has done remarkable work on this, put out a study last year that found a significant increase in support for political violence in recent years, certainly among Republicans, but also among Democrats to some extent. And those supporting violence were much more likely to believe in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, including the Great Replacement and QAnon. And similar poll data from the ADL and 1.8 underscored that belief in conspiracy theories is among the best predictors of anti-Semitism. And a new survey that just recently came out from the University of Chicago and the ADL a few months ago found that highly anti-Semitic Americans are significantly more likely to support political violence and other forms of anti-democratic extremism. And at the same time, the Center for Countering Digital Hate has found that belief in these conspiracy theories is even higher among younger Americans, among teens, and disproportionately high among those who spend a large amount of time on social media. And so all of this tells us that this is a feedback loop, right? The ways in which these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have become normalized in our society, in turn, lay the groundwork for belief in support for political violence and broader anti-democratic extremism. And that anti-democratic extremism, in turn, creates situations in societies that make Jews and each and every community less safe. And so what do we do about it? I'm sure we'll talk a lot about this in the remaining part of the panel, but I want to go back to where we started this conversation, which is the sorts of society we need. Kaplan's understanding of democracy. Bill articulated this beautifully. The well-being and flourishing of all of its members equally, of all of society's members equally. The ability to empower all of society's members to have a say in their norms and values of the society in which they live. And societies in which different groups can live according to each of their ideals, but not in silos, instead in harmony, right? And so that is what an inclusive liberal democracy is about, in which each and every person is able to live and worship and pray and exist safely and freely. And as it turns out, it's actually explaining to people the ways in which anti-Semitism connects to their own safety and to the ability to protect those sorts of inclusive societies that is most resonant in bringing them into the fight for Jewish safety. We've been engaged in research that, among other things, found that for 18 to 34-year-olds especially, the most effective message is one that connects their safety to Jewish safety, that helps them understand anti-Semitism fuels other forms of hate and fundamentally undercuts our democracy. And we do that not simply by just being in dialogue with other people, although dialogue and relationships are important, but by mobilizing together towards these shared inclusive democracies, towards the society that we know we all need. And I'll end by saying this can't be considered partisan. We're living in a year where so many people are telling us that the fight for democracy is fundamentally partisan. And we can't let that become true. We need to, whether we are a congregational rabbi or the leader of a 501c3 or whatever position we hold, we need to make clear that democracy matters to each and every one of us, no matter our politics, no matter our backgrounds, and that we can't let it become a partisan wedge at a time when so many are trying to do that. So really excited to be here and excited for the conversation we'll have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for your opening comments. I just want to reflect that as you're all speaking, what I keep hearing in my mind, and I'm not sure if anybody wants to address this, I'll throw it out there. Maybe you will, maybe you won't, is the ways in which the language of freedom, the language of preserving freedom has actually become oppositional to the kind of multicultural, liberal, progressive democracy that we're talking about. And I'm particularly thinking about it, particularly in America, but we've also seen this recently since October 7th in Israel as well, the freedom to own guns, the freedom to own means of protection, which also become means of harming others, is language that gets used as to underscore a value of freedom, as if that is the purpose of democracy, that in contradistinction to a little bit of self-censoring, not even self-censoring, but adjusting so that freedom is really about everybody thriving, not just the self-thriving, not just the one thriving. And so that feels like it's a barely articulated thought, but it feels like something that I'd love to dig into at some point. So I'm going to ask, now that you've all heard each other, how can we dig in a little further? Aaron or Bill, who shall go first among you two gentlemen?
Go ahead, Aaron. Go ahead, Aaron. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot to talk about. I just want to pick up on a couple of things that Amy Spitalnick just said that I think are that really resonated for me. One is this like calling out of anti-Semitism as a conspiracy theory. Like I think that is we're about to celebrate Purim, and that's a 2,500-year-old conspiracy. Like at the heart of that tale is a 2,500-year-old conspiracy theory. And that to me is like the original version of misinformation and disinformation, which we're confronting all the time in the media now. So I think thinking about anti-Semitism as a proto form of misinformation and disinformation like allows us to look at the specific experience of Jews in the United States as like a canary in the coal mine around threats to democracy. I think that's a really important thing. And the other thing I'll say that I think emerged a little bit from again Amy Spitalnick's comments is the ways in which those conspiracy theories, the conspiracy theories that are now all around us, challenges and erodes our confidence in institutions, whether that's the media, whether that's government, religion. I think that's a major feature of the precariousness of our democracy right now also, and something I think we need to be really attentive to and really concerned about, and figure out how to reinforce confidence in institutions, even maybe I don't even want to say even, like with full acknowledgement that institutions are imperfect. I think we've developed this sense that institutions, when they fail us because of their imperfections, we should abandon them. And I think the opposite is true. I think the opposite is true in Judaism as an institution, which is deeply imperfect, deeply flawed, and like requires us to sort of stick with it. I think the same is true with the state of Israel. I think the same is true with the United States of America. Deeply flawed, imperfect institutions, but their imperfections are should not be reason for us to abandon them. They should be reason for us to be like digging in and doing the work.
Amy Klein, have you anything that you want to respond from what you've been hearing from Amy and Aaron in particular?
I mean, I think I have a question perhaps of Amy, but which is, but it's a very, it's a very current event question. So I'll just throw it out there, which is, how do you walk the line of not feeding anti-Semitism? And also, this is like, I'm going to say something that's my preference, okay? And also, it may not be other people's on the, on these screens. Walking that line of not feeding anti-Semitism and supporting President Biden's efforts to pressure Israel to do the right thing.
Look, I mean, this is exactly where all of our work is living right now, which is that I started my job full-time September 5th. So I had exactly a month in the role before all of our worlds really shattered in the way that we now know so well, you more than anyone, Amy, perhaps. And so we, the ways in which these issues are intersecting with very real current events related to Jewish advocacy, related to our voice in our government, related to how our government grapples with a conflict in the Middle East that is having very real ripple effects here at home. And actors in all different directions are in turn exploiting it to further the very same conspiracy theories and extremism that fuel the illiberal ideas that undercut our democracy and that in turn tear communities apart and make all of us less safe. And it's been a challenge, right? And I think the way Aaron actually described it in terms of both sort of, the Jewish community's mobilization, whether it be through the March on Washington or the broader advocacy that we've seen over the last 5.5 months, is one manifestation of democracy. But so too is, for example, Senator Chuck Schumer taking to the floor of the Senate and using his voice, not just as a Jew, but as a prominent elected official in this country, to criticize Israel and to push our own government and our own institutions to hold the complexity of this conflict in a way that perhaps we haven't been so good at doing. And so that is true certainly in, all of the room. There was a period of time in the fall where it felt like the Biden administration, to their credit, was really meeting with Jewish leaders on a weekly basis, whether it be the president himself or cabinet secretaries and others. And I'm enormously grateful for that. And they've been incredibly responsive. And the way part of our goal in that meeting, or all of our goals in those meetings in terms of the JCPA team and some of our allied organizations, was to help represent the complexity of the views within the Jewish community. That not all of us agree on every single thing, and that's actually okay. We are very united in pain and grief in this moment. We all agree that what happened on October 7th was a horrific atrocity, that Israel had a right to defend itself against it, that the anti-Semitism it was fueling here at home was unparalleled and horrifying. And also there were ways in which people in that room fundamentally disagreed about the specifics of what the conflict, the war in Gaza should look like, and how Israel should continue to respond, or what the response to anti-Semitism and other forms here at home required. Does it require more funding for things like the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Ed? We have a great historic anti-Semitism strategy that the White House put out in May. Is that the right blueprint? And so fundamentally leaning into those differences in our community while still being, I think, largely united around sort of core values, actually for me was the manifestation of all of this, and sort of is how this all should work without playing into some of the tropes around Jewish control and power, and that so often color conversations around Jewish advocacy. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's how I felt like it played out in real time over the last 5.5 months.
I just want to like echo and reinforce that one of the things, Amy Spitalnick, that you just said that I think is so important is like embracing complexity, right? Like we're so many of the people that I talk to one-on-one are able to hold nuance, and so few of the public kind of bully pulpit voices are able to do that. So like my answer, Amy Klein, to your question is like, hold clear values and positions, do so with nuance and humility, and avoid hyperbole about the people who disagree, right? Like that's like, we have to make that path by walking it. And Elyse, I'll just like pick up on your question about freedom. Like, yeah, part of the beauty of liberal democracy is that it's like a lot of it is about preserving freedom and an awareness that for a lot of human history, governments suppressed human freedom, and part of what the founders in their genius did in the United States was like provide tons of barriers to the government interfering with my freedom. I'm glad they did that, because governments, because they have a monopoly on the use of force, like tend to overreach and use it. And that thing needs to be balanced with lots of other interests that exist in a country. And I don't know, like we can have a really interesting and robust conversation about whether my freedom to bear arms where that comes up against all the other things that, that a heavily armed society does wrong. I think it's complicated. So that nuance, lack of hyperbole, and like holding your values clear, that's where I land on that question. So I think, Amy Klein, a great question.
And I might add, the piece that I would add to that is that at the same time, Amy Spitalnick, that you describe being in the room at the at the highest levels of our government and representing nuance, we're also hopefully spending time outside of that room, reconnecting and doubling down on our relationships with the other people who may not have been in that room in other communities at the moment, because the other way to combat the conspiracy theories and the anti-Semitism is to make sure that the people that I think we that we need to be in relationship with, going back to Aaron's earlier point, and actually to Kaplan's earlier points, that multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural democracy is actually where we thrive. That actually requires us continuing to double down on those relationships with the other cultural, racial, ethnic, religious groups that we share this place with. And so that actually feels just as urgent as some of the other things that we're talking about.
Well, and if I can just quickly say, I mean, there have been so many in the last 5.5 months who've told, me and at JCPA, JCRC's Jewish Community Relations Councils around the country, that the aftermath of October 7th, the pain, the grief that we are all rightfully feeling about how certain communities responded or certain leaders responded, is therefore proof of failure of doing the coalition and bridge building work we need to be. And for me, it's proof of need. It is telling me that we need to be investing more and deeply in how we actually sit in these challenging conversations, in this complexity, sit down with people across communities, not just because, again, not just dialogue for the sake of dialogue, but because it's actually living in that complexity that you build the coalitions you need to mobilize for the inclusive democracy we all need. And so literally right after this, I'm at AFT at the National Teachers Union's headquarters in DC because we're trying to model that. I'm doing a program with my friends, Eric Ward, who I'm sure many of you know from Race Forward, formerly the Western State Center, and with Wajahat Ali, who's a Muslim American leader, and with the leaders of Standing Together to sort of model how we can bring and bridge these challenging conversations both here and in Israel at a time when all of our futures depend on it. And it's not perfect. None of us agree on everything, but that's not the point. We all agree that we need inclusive liberal democracies for each of our communities to thrive.
Amy Klein, do the conversations that we're having in America, in the United States, help those of you in Israel who are fighting this fight? Does it give you good information and modeling, or is it irrelevant to the battle that you're fighting?
Which conversations are you referring to?
The conversations, the work of building multi-faith coalitions, of doubling down on our relationships with others and putting forward a vision of multi-ethnic, multicultural democracy. Is that a helpful value? Did the Jews in Israel understand when American Jews talk about that, or is it just so foreign that it's not really part of the conversation?
At this point, it's not part of the conversation. I think that Standing Together is an example of an organization that's been doing that kind of work, and the immediate response after October 7th was to, set up teams to make sure that in case there was an explosion of violence or in mixed cities in particular, that they would, that could contain and be out there as voices to contain, but it's not the same thing. And those kinds of conversations aren't on the radar screen. And right now, since October 7th, there's no room, there's no space. I just say really quickly that there are those of us who have the energy and are out there protesting. There are people who are protesting in different ways, but there's still so much of the quiet, they're fighting. I don't know how to Seket Yorim, I don't know the English translation for that. And it's really I'll say that also there were polls done, and the number one fear is that the hostages won't be returned, and I'll say that's really real. And people are worried about the fighting and how that's going to happen and where that's going to go. And they're not afraid about the fascist, Kahanistic, messianic government that is demolishing, this container. Aaron, you use this image of a container, and I was thinking our container already had holes in it, lots of holes in it, and or lots of cracks in it, and that's not so. What gets on the radar screen, that's not even on the radar screen. So we're doing a big mobilization in Caesarea starting tomorrow night for the next 3 days to try to shake some people up, in hopes that then the call to come to Jerusalem next Tuesday will actually get more than a few hundred people. Stay tuned, see if is it going to work? I don't know, but in our institutional democracy, in our Jewish institutional democracy, the Knesset is going out for, you know, Pesach vacation at the end of the month. And so, you know, we're going to try to move this not give up and try to do this effort. Sorry, I'm taking a little time on current events here. It's related to democracy, but we're, you know, to try to actually get elections on the, you know, on the calendar. Is it gonna, are we gonna succeed? Probably not. Do we have to try? Yes. So the radar screen's really different.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bill, I want to bring you back into the conversation and to help put this in to put it in,
Sure.
do what you're going to do.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm reflecting on the things that the panelists have been discussing, and I want to I'll say a few things and maybe sort of generate a question that the panelists can entertain, and then it can generate, you know, more questions from the community, from the audience. I'm going to read a quotation from Kaplan. I'll start with that, which is about freedom. So I'll start by saying something about freedom, which is that, so Kaplan says, and this is in Judaism as a Civilization in 1931, he says, religious freedom is not merely freedom to entertain any or no conception of God. It is essentially the freedom to remain loyal to one's historic culture, right? So here you get a very, very strong sense of Kaplan's sense of group freedom. And then he goes on to say, and in the original, this is italicized, the notion that allegiance to a state precludes identification with more than one nation will therefore have to be scrapped. Now, what he says here, right, is not, he doesn't mean that I can be loyal to the United States or allegiant to the United States and then also France. That's not what he means by nation. What he means is different kinds of group communities within the nation, within the United States of America. You could understand those as religious, you could understand those as national, you could understand those as ethnic in some way, racial, what have you. So one of the things to appreciate here is that Kaplan's conception of freedom, therefore, is inherently social. He's not alone in this. This is a sort of a tradition within a Western political thought that sees freedom as not being inherently individualistic, that sees freedom as essentially tied up with participating in shaping the norms and values of the society. That's what I was saying in my original definition. I didn't spell this out then, but that by freedom, being a free person means being a person who engages actively in the process of shaping the norms and values of the society. That's the Kaplan's sort of democratic conception of freedom. So there are times in democracy where freedom means taking a stand as an individual. For example, as Thoreau beautifully wrote about civil disobedience, meaning taking a stand about taking a stand in opposition to the law. In this case, in Thoreau's case, slavery, right? In opposition to slavery, saying that the law of the land was immoral, and willing to take an individual stand and to act on individual conscience. But the act of individual conscience is meant to serve the community and the society. The act of individual conscience is an act of service for the society. And so freedom is also tied up very much in service. And this is a different conception of freedom than we're used to hearing from what I'll call very broadly libertarian conceptions of freedom as kind of strict individuality, right? So it's a very, very different conception of freedom that again, is inherently tied up with community and public service. The other thing I'll say, what I'm hearing a lot from the panelists is the significance of fear and the way that fear erodes democratic commitments and democratic commitment to democratic institutions. And I'm also thinking about, Aaron, what you were saying before about the characteristics of the citizens who participate in democratic conversation with humility, right? And that humility is it allows people to do, I think, two things, right? One is it's associated with recognizing that one's own commitments and beliefs might turn out not to be the best ones. They might turn out to be false or wrong in some way. So when I'm engaging in conversation, I'm really open to the possibility that I might learn something from someone else. and that their vision of a good society is different, right? Is better, might turn out to be better than mine, or valuable in some way. But the other thing is that I think one of the things that constantly happens, and this goes back to Kaplan's observations from the 1930s, is that sometimes societies put a limit on who they think can really participate in the conversation about how to live. And so they say that certain people, right, Aaron, before you talked about nativism, right, anti-Semitism, racism against various groups, that tries to say, that epistemological, epistemic humility, right, sort of deep within the pragmatist tradition from which Kaplan's drawing, that there are people who try to put a limit on who's allowed to take part in the conversation, right? So my question for us, I think, is a sort of a big question, is how do we cultivate that humility and that ethos of capaciousness, and also, if we could call it fallibilism, recognizing that my own beliefs might be wrong, and the capaciousness to recognize that other groups can also be, other groups can be good citizens, can serve the society, that just because they have a certain religious belief or racial identity doesn't mean that their participation in the society is going to come at my expense or undermine our society in some way, right? All of these forms of racism and anti discrimination against religious groups, et cetera, all of these things kind of undermine that. But we have to sort of educate people for that, right? Because we have to have the ethos in order for the institutions to function, right? What ends up undermining the institutions, I think this is what you're all sort of speaking to, both in the American context and in Israel, is that when people have lost that ethos, the institutions can be exploited and undermined. And so how do we educate for that? How do we, or cultivate that? How do we cultivate those, whether it's humility or openness or other kinds of characteristics in people that would allow a democratic society to thrive and flourish?
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Bill. I think you've actually addressed what I was beginning to say earlier about the misuse of the word freedom, and freedom as an uber individualistic stance that doesn't actually hold within it the humility that you're talking about, which feels absolutely necessary. In the time that's left, I'm going to offer a few questions that have come up in the chat. People should feel free to write a few more. I don't know that we'll get to them all, but I've got two questions that I see come up that I want to share with you. One is, in this era of seemingly siloed communities of discourse and sources of information, what is the common glue that holds democracy together now? How are we able to have the conversations that we're talking about and debates if we can't actually agree on the terms or the facts or who we in conversation with? And I think that that's a particularly relevant question in an age of disinformation and social media to ask. So I don't know if there's who would like to take that on. I'm looking to Amy, Spitalnick, and Aaron maybe to think about that.
I can start. Look, I'll say a few things, I guess. First and foremost, and particularly for us as Jews right now, it's hard not to hear the loudest voices. And so I think we are feeling very isolated and alone right now, because the loudest voices on social media and sometimes on the streets or outside our synagogues or wherever they might be are loud. And they're also not necessarily representative of where the vast majority of people are. And so it's important to start from that place, because I think we are still very much in the trauma of post-October 7th. October 7th isn't over. It's not over in Israel, and our trauma as American Jews as it relates to it is not over till the hostages are free and the war is over. And we can, there's no semblance of normalcy, but we can at least feel like we've moved into another phase here. And so starting with that is really important, because it helps us understand who are we talking about here? And if you actually look at the poll data, it tells us that we are largely, as a society, more united on some basic things than those loudest voices will have us believe. Everything I said earlier is true, and that belief in political violence has gone up, belief in conspiracy theories has gone up. But also, if you poll people on, whether anti-Semitism is a real threat, how does it hurt our democracy? Do they support Israel's right to exist? All of the things that we are sort of grappling with right now as a community, overwhelmingly, people generally agree with those things. And so I think we're being told that we're all alone right now by some of the loudest voices, both outside of our community and frankly, some within our community who are trying to use this to further a certain sort of zero-sum worldview. And the reality is it's much more complex than that, which is sort of the theme of everything we're talking about here. That being said, of course, there are people where we're sort of having fundamentally different conversations, not just fundamentally different facts, but fundamentally different language, right? I think about a webinar I did a few months ago with an Arab American organization. It was for a national initiative called Bedrock, which focuses on combating hate-fueled violence. And in that conversation, she was talking about how, for her, terms like from the river to the sea and intifada mean something fundamentally different than I hear. And I, had to explain, particularly for Jewish American whose relationship to Israel really came of age during the Second Intifada, and what that means to me. Like, it told me we were speaking fundamentally different languages when it came to the moment we're in. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because it means sometimes, yes, people are speaking from a place of maliciousness, but it also means some people are just speaking from a place of difference, or in some cases, ignorance or misinformation or lack of understanding. And also, it's okay in some of these cases for there to actually be disagreement, right? It's gradient. And so how we actually understand who we're talking to and what that gradient is, so that we can know who we can engage and who is, frankly, beyond that red line of being able to. The people who celebrated October 7th on the streets on October 8th are people that I don't think that we're going to be able to be in coalition right now. But people like this Arab American leader, or some of the folks I mentioned earlier, and a number of the other groups who might be saying things I fundamentally disagree with, or might be, some of which might be rooted in mis or disinformation, like understanding where they're coming from and why that's happening, and how we actually can try to stay at the table with them wherever possible, feels deeply important right now. And I would add, there's actual policies that we can move to support how we build societies that are better consumers of social media and of the news, including teaching media and digital literacy, not just in our schools, but frankly, for all of us. We like to pick on the youngest Americans, but all of us are not the smartest consumers of social media, because it is evolving on a minute by minute basis. And there are very real efforts, including, the not just real people online, but bots and others who are actively seeking to mislead us. And so part of this means also investing in that advocacy, investing in those sorts of policies that are, again, inherently linked with the broader fight for inclusive democracy that we're talking about here. And we are, in particular, that will be one of the key pieces of a democracy action network that we are launching at JCPA. Aaron and his team are also part of that network. And I think in general, the ways in which these pieces all fit together are really how we ultimately move the needle.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Aaron,
Elyse, can I jump in with one quick, can I just jump in with one quick thought on that? I just want to plus one everything Amy just said, and I'll offer one other kind of complementary observation, which is I think we're all and this is like Jews in America in the 20th century, going back to everybody everywhere all the time. We're too quick to draw lines and push people outside of them. Right, like in Athens, we exiled people. In in medieval Jewish times, we put them in cherem, or subjected them to karet. The Catholic Church excommunicated them. We have a fantasy as human beings that if we expel people, they disappear, and that's not true. Right, there were 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump in 2020. There were 81 million people who voted for Joe Biden in 2020. None of us are going anywhere. There are people who are chanting from the river to the sea. There are people who are, BB right or wrong, who are, settler, people who want to occupy Judea and Samaria, and forgetting what the word is, but claim that territory as part of Greater Israel. We're stuck with each other as human beings. So I think that it's incumbent on us to try to figure out how to draw those lines of who we're going to expel as like narrowly as possible about those people, because we have to figure out how to like build this country, build Israel, build the global community that we want to build with each other. And I think that goes back to what Bill was talking about, that kind of humility and willingness to listen and like speak clearly from our values, but not in a way that's hyperbolic, all those kinds of things.
You're reminding me of something I heard Sally Abed of Standing Together say, which is that in her case, she was talking very clearly about Israelis and Palestinians, that we're either going to live together, find a way to live together, or we're not. And that I think that's actually true in a global community as well. I have one more question from the chat that I want to share with you. If I can ask you to briefly respond, if possible. I think all four of you might have a sentence on this, and then we'll go to our final wrap-up question. And this is a question that is interesting from a different perspective for all of us. What is the role or value of democracy within Jewish communities and institutions? Organizations are not always organized democratically. Sometimes they can't be. Sometimes they have to be hierarchical. And there are a growing number of attempts to exclude or deny bad or wrong or not appropriate Jewish opinions. So I wonder if you could give a thought to the role of democracy within Jewish community and Jewish institutions. Bill, let's start with you.
Well, of course, that's a major theme in Kaplan's work, and I think that, and I would say that it's, I think the original question that was asked about this is about institutions, and I think that it points to a couple of things that Kaplan was interested in and concerned with. Is one is if Jewish organizations aren't organized democratically, it's going to be hard to really build the allegiance of American Jews who are really committed to that democratic ethos. So for the Jewish community to be vital in all of the ways it needs to be, he thinks it needs to be democratic, right? So there's a kind of strategic point to that, but I think he obviously thinks this is the right thing. I also think that probably, and I think he would say this, is that if, in a sense, like what Jewish communities are doing is not just building the community for themselves, but for the common good. And that's in the American sense, but also in the international sense. I could read you another quote from Kaplan where he talks about internationalism, but he's an internationalist in that sense, that ultimately the goal of democracy in any one nation is for the sake of international peace and justice. And so I think within American society, I think you would say Jews have an obligation. Well, let me put it this way. Jews can't create their own organizations to be undemocratic and expect that the rest of society is just going to be democratic when they want it to be, right? We got to do the work all the way down, right? It's a kind of principle of integrity. And so I think that to understand that the urgency for our Jewish communal organizations to have a democratic ethos within them is crucial for this work, because we can't really do the work well without that sense of integrity.
I'll just add two very quick thoughts that are very current in terms of their timeliness for our community. Of course, we were this week having a conversation about whether remarks by the highest ever Jewish official in U.S. government or elected official are sufficiently within the pro-Israel tent. And I think if we're having a conversation about whether Chuck Schumer is sufficiently pro-Israel or fits within the tent, we need to think about maybe building a different tent or restructuring the tent that we have, because there's something wrong with it. And no matter how people feel about the specifics of that, if we're living at a moment where the conversation is someone like Chuck Schumer is in or out, that tells me we need to think about what's wrong with that tent. And I will say this played out in real time, sort of like on the pages of the Jewish press over the last 24 hours, because JCPA is a very proud member of the Conference of Presidents. And also, after a call with Senator Schumer yesterday, they put out a statement that very much sort of took on Senator Schumer in a way that I think a number of members of the conference didn't agree with. And we are now sort of seeing what it means to have democracy within our institutions and within our community play out, both in terms of what that tent looks like and who organizations speak for when they speak. And these are conversations we need to have. I'm glad that we're having this conversation, not because I agree with every single word Senator Schumer said, not because I disagree with every single thing the Conference of Presidents said, but we need to actually be talking about what does democracy look like within our communities if we're going to be advocating for it outside of our communities.
Thank you. Thank you. And I liked Aaron wrote the quote that you offered earlier, which is, we're going to need a bigger tent. The question of who defines the legs or sides or walls of tents is one that I think we could delve into for another whole webinar. That's a very important question. So briefly, in those last 4 minutes, there is an election coming in the United States that we're all gearing up for. There is the potential return of protest and civil activism in Israel and the desire, at least for some people, for an election. What should Jews be thinking about and doing right now to do the work that we believe is necessary to support a liberal, progressive, inclusive democracy? Lightning round. Amy Klein.
Are you asking, what do I think Jews in the United States should be doing to help us here? Look, I mean, those of us in Israel are trying to do, what we're doing on the ground. It's very specific. It's very different. I kind of call it living in the streets. I'm at sort of a point in this conversation here where I'm not sure that I feel like I can give a summary statement. Except that I'll say this. From where I am and where I stand, I'm really thankful to President Biden and to Chuck Schumer. I need to just say that clearly. The threat to Israel's democracy is so great. It is just so great. And I think that if it's not clear that our current prime minister is the source of that threat, and that he has made a covenant with, I'll just say it, he's made a covenant with the devil, and we have so much to do to repair after the massacre by the Hamas and the rebuilding of our country, and we cannot do it with the current government in power. It will not happen. Those who cause the destruction cannot do the repair. So what we need in Israel to survive as a liberal democratic country is the support from the American Jewish community of a liberal and democratic country. And I'll just end with one thought of, that Bill brought up this idea of freedom being service to society. And after October 7th, the whole protest movement shifted to service to society. That was service to the troops. That was service to the hostage families. That was service to survivors of the Nova and of the massacre in the Western Negev, and now those groups are turning back to the work of the protest, but with a really clear statement of a commitment of service to society, of rebuilding the society, and of hoping to put in place in our parliament and in our government people who are committed to that.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you. I've put into the chat links to all of the organizations represented here today, including Standing Together, Omdim Biachad in Israel, which is the organization that Amy works with, which, if nothing else, I will plug it, could use your support financially and otherwise to do the work that they're doing. I've also put up the links to the Kaplan Center. Thank you so much to the Kaplan Center and Eric Kaplan for starting us off today, and also to the JCPA and to A More Perfect Union, the Jewish Partnership for Democracy. Both of those organizations have wonderful resources on their websites and are gearing up to engage in the serious work and allow you find ways to connect you up to the work that they are doing. So I am going to put that plug in there. We are out of time. So I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Amy. And thank you, Amy. And thank you, Eric at the Kaplan Center and Jeffrey Shine at the Kaplan Center, who helped to organize this as well. There will be a recording made available to all of those who participated, who were here today. We will send it to you, and it will also be available on our website and possibly the website of the other organizations. So again, thank you. And for all of us who are doing this work, I will just end by giving the blessing that the work of your hands shall be established for good, and that you find moments of joy and moments of succor in finding partnerships with each other. And thank you again for being a part of this today.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.